She was captured by enemy soldiers, but one of them disobeyed orders. WW2. He risked his life to protect the woman he was meant to destroy. Chapter 1. The Frozen Forest. The silence of the Ardennes was a lie. It was a thick, heavy blanket of snow that muffled the world, but underneath it the forest was alive with tension. Every snap of a frozen twig sounded like a gunshot. Every gust of wind through the skeletal branches of the oaks and beeches whispered of unseen threats. For Sergeant Ilara Vance, known as Ellie to the few who knew her well, this treacherous quiet was the sound of her work. Huddled in the lee of a moss-covered boulder, her fingers, numb inside her woolen gloves, moved with practiced precision. Her pencil scratched faintly against the waterproof paper of her map, charting the impossible contours of a German supply depot she'd spent 3 days observing. Snow fell in lazy fat flakes, clinging to the collar of her M1943 field jacket and melting on her eyelashes. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs, a physical presence that stole her breath. Back in Ohio, a winter like this meant cozy evenings by the fire and the smell of cinnamon. Here it was just another enemy, as relentless and impersonal as the war itself. She paused, blowing a warm cloud of air into her cupped hands, her gaze sweeping over the snow-draped landscape. She wasn't a soldier in the traditional sense. She didn't carry a rifle with the ease of the GIs she'd trained with. Her weapons were a compass, a keen eye for topography, and a mind that could see the patterns of an army in the tracks left in the mud. Her mission was to be a ghost, to see without being seen, and to deliver the information that would save lives. A sudden sharp crack to her left broke the stillness. It wasn't a falling branch. It was the sound of a heavy boot on frozen wood. Ellie froze, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs with a frantic, muffled rhythm. Her training kicked in, a cold wave of adrenaline washing over her initial panic. Slowly, deliberately, she tucked the map into the inner pocket of her jacket and slid her hand to the handle of the Colt M1911 holstered at her side. She flattened herself against the rock, her green and brown fatigues offering meager camouflage against the vast whiteness of the snow. The crunching grew closer. 2 voices, low and guttural. German. They were close, too close. A patrol likely sweeping the area. She held her breath, praying the falling snow would obscure her position. Through a gap in the branches she saw them, 2 figures in long grey coats, their Stahlhelm helmets dusted with white. They moved with a weary confidence, their Mauser rifles held loosely in their hands. They passed her position, their boots sinking deep into the snow, not 10 yards away. Ellie's body screamed for her to stay still, to let them pass, to become one with the frozen earth. But then a third voice, harsher, more commanding. Another figure emerged from the trees, and this one was different. His uniform was darker, the collar tabs bearing the stark silver sigils of the SS. He stopped, his head cocked as if listening to something only he could hear. His eyes, cold and pale as the winter sky, scanned the forest. Ellie felt a chilling certainty that he was looking right at her. She knew with a sinking dread that the silence had betrayed her. He barked an order. The 2 soldiers fanned out. One of them began moving directly towards her boulder. There was no escape. Pulling her pistol would be suicide. As the soldier rounded the rock, his eyes widened in surprise for a fraction of a second before his training took over. "Halt! Hände hoch!" he yelled, his rifle snapping up to point directly at her heart. The SS officer approached, a cruel, thin smile gracing his lips as he looked down at her. "Well, well," he said in heavily accented but clear English. "Look what the forest has given us. An American mouse, far from her hole." The cold steel of the rifle barrel against her back was the last thing she felt before the world became a blur of snow and shouting. Her mission was over. A new, terrifying ordeal had just begun. Chapter 2. The Shadow of the Eagle. The cellar stank of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and stale cigarette smoke. It was a small, cramped space beneath a bombed-out farmhouse, now serving as a makeshift German command post. A single kerosene lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls, making the room feel like a living, breathing tomb. Ellie sat on a rickety wooden crate, her hands bound tightly in front of her with coarse rope that bit into her wrists. The chilling cold from the stone floor seeped through her trousers, a relentless ache that reached her bones. Her map, the precious result of weeks of perilous work, was gone. Across from her, seated at a crude table, was the SS officer, Obersturmführer Brandt. He had her map spread out before him, studying her meticulous markings with an air of detached appreciation, as if admiring a piece of art. He was a man of sharp angles, a pointed chin, a narrow nose, and eyes that held a chilling lack of emotion. His uniform was immaculate, a stark contrast to the grime of the cellar and the weary, mud-spattered soldiers who stood guard. "Sergeant Ilara Vance, Office of Strategic Services," Brandt said, his voice calm, almost conversational. He hadn't looked at her papers. He seemed to know. A cartographer, a dangerous profession for a woman so far from home. "You are very good at your job. These markings, they are precise. They tell me you have been watching us for some time." Ellie remained silent, her jaw set. She met his gaze, refusing to show the fear that was a cold knot in her stomach. She recited her name, rank, and serial number in her mind, a mantra of defiance. Brandt sighed, a sound of theatrical disappointment. "Protocol is so tedious. We both know you have more to tell me than your name. We are in the midst of a great offensive. Your information is valuable. You can make it easy on yourself, Sergeant, or you can make it very, very difficult." He gestured to a corner of the cellar where a bucket of murky water and a collection of grim-looking tools rested. The door at the top of the stone steps creaked open, and a soldier descended. He was older than the others, his face deeply lined with a weariness that went beyond the battlefield. His grey Wehrmacht uniform was faded and worn at the elbows, and he carried his rifle with a resigned familiarity, not the aggressive readiness of the SS. Brandt didn't look up. "Richter, you will stand guard. Do not let our guest get comfortable. I will return in 1 hour. By then I expect she will be more willing to talk." The older soldier, Richter, gave a curt nod, his eyes avoiding both Brandt and Ellie. He took up a position near the steps, his back to the wall, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. Brandt ascended the stairs, his boots echoing with finality, and the heavy wooden door slammed shut, plunging the cellar into a deeper quiet, broken only by the hiss of the lantern. For a long time there was only silence. Ellie watched the guard, Klaus Richter. He didn't look at her. He seemed lost in his own world, his shoulders slumped with a weight she couldn't begin to comprehend. He was nothing like Brandt. There was no cruelty in his posture, only a profound exhaustion. The fear in Ellie's stomach began to mix with a sliver of curiosity. Who was this man? Her throat was painfully dry, her lips cracked. "Water," she rasped, the word tearing at her throat. "Please." Richter's head twitched, a barely perceptible movement. He remained still for a moment longer, as if weighing the command against the request. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he unhooked the canteen from his belt. He walked over to her, his movements stiff. He knelt, his knees cracking in the cold, and held the canteen to her lips. The water was icy cold and tasted of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever felt. She drank greedily, some of it spilling down her chin. When she was finished, he pulled it away. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, met hers for the first time. In them she saw no malice, no victory. She saw only a deep, profound sorrow. He then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, dense piece of black bread. He broke off a piece and held it out to her. Ellie hesitated, her mind racing. Was this a trick? A way to gain her trust before the real interrogation began? "Essen," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "Eat." He pushed the bread gently towards her lips. She looked from the bread to his face. This was not the act of a guard trying to soften up a prisoner for his superior. This was the act of a man seeing another human being in distress. It was a risk, a small but significant rebellion against the cold cruelty of Brandt and everything he represented. Cautiously, she opened her mouth and took the bread. It was stale and hard, but it was sustenance. As she chewed, their eyes remained locked. In that silent, shared moment, in the cold, stinking cellar, a fragile, unspoken question hung in the air. Why? Chapter 3. An Act of Treason. An hour stretched into an eternity in the suffocating silence of the cellar. The only sounds were the slow drip of melting snow from the stones above and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the old soldier, Klaus Richter. When the heavy door at the top of the stairs finally scraped open, Ellie's entire body tensed. Obersturmführer Brandt descended, his polished boots making sharp, decisive sounds on the stone steps. He was carrying a leather satchel, which he placed on the table with a soft thud. "I trust your time for reflection has been productive, Sergeant," Brandt said, his voice laced with a chilling pleasantry. He pulled a chair over and sat directly in front of her, so close she could smell the faint scent of bay rum and cold wool. Let us begin again. You were observing the depot near Bastogne. I want to know what you reported. Radio frequencies, the names of your contacts, the locations of any partisan cells you may have encountered. Ellie stared at a point just past his shoulder, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Sergeant Ilara Vance, serial number 9487201. Brant's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened into chips of ice. He reached into his satchel and pulled out her instruments, her compass, her protractor, her finely sharpened pencils. He laid them out on the table one by one. These are the tools of an artist, he mused, and you are an artist of landscapes. But landscapes change. Armies move. Your art becomes obsolete very quickly. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But you, Sergeant, you can provide a new masterpiece, a map of the American lines, their morale, their supply situation. Paint me that picture, and this entire unpleasantness can be forgotten. Sergeant Ilara Vance, she began, but her voice cracked. Brant's facade of civility shattered. He slammed his hand on the table, making the lantern jump and flicker wildly. Do not mistake my patience for weakness, he snarled, his face contorting with fury. I have broken men far stronger than you, men who begged to tell me what I wanted to know by the end. He stood up, pacing the small space like a caged predator. He stopped and looked at Klaus, who had remained impassive in the corner. Richter, see that she does not sleep. Give her no water. By sunrise we will have a proper conversation. He ascended the stairs without another word, the slam of the door sealing them once again in the gloom. The echoes of his rage hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ellie's carefully constructed walls of defiance began to crumble. She could feel tears welling in her eyes, hot and sharp, and she fought to hold them back. She would not give him the satisfaction. Minutes passed. The only sound was the hiss of the lantern. Then she heard movement. Klaus Richter was walking towards her. He stopped in front of her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He looked towards the door, listening intently. Satisfied, he knelt down again, his movements slow and deliberate. From the depths of his worn coat, he produced a small, tarnished silver locket. He fumbled with the clasp, his thick fingers clumsy, and opened it. Inside were two tiny, faded photographs, one of a woman with kind eyes, the other of a young girl with a bright, gap-toothed smile. Meine family, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. My family. My daughter, Lisa. She is, like you, strong, brave. He looked from the picture to Ellie, and for the first time she saw the man behind the uniform. A father, a husband, a man trapped in a nightmare. This war, it takes everything, makes monsters of us all. He closed the locket and tucked it away. His movements became urgent. Brant, he is a monster. He will not stop. Tomorrow, it will be very bad for you. He glanced at the door again, his fear palpable. The guard changes in 2 hours, before dawn. The new man is young, lazy, stays by the stove in the kitchen. I will make a noise. A problem with the generator outside. From another pocket, he produced a small, crudely sharpened piece of metal. A file, perhaps, broken from a larger tool. He pressed it into her bound hands, his fingers warm against her cold skin. Your ropes. Saw them. When you hear the generator stop, you have minutes. Go out the back, north, towards the river. The trees are thick there. Ellie stared at him, her mind reeling. This was treason. He was signing his own death warrant. Why? She breathed, the question that had been burning in her since he first gave her the bread. Klaus's tired eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw a universe of pain and regret. I have not seen my daughter in 3 years, he said softly, his broken English heavy with sorrow. If I die, I want to die as a man she would not be ashamed of, not as one of them. He squeezed her hands gently around the metal file. Now, be silent and be ready. Chapter 4. The Sound of a Thaw. The next 2 hours were the longest of Ellie's life. The rough metal file felt both impossibly small and incredibly heavy in her hands. Every creak of the farmhouse floorboards above, every distant shout, sent a fresh wave of ice-cold dread through her. She worked in the dark, shielded by Klaus's broad back as he stood his post. Her fingers, raw and clumsy with cold, moved frantically, sawing at the thick rope. The fibers parted with agonizing slowness, the rasping sound deafening in the charged silence. Doubt gnawed at her. This was insane. A desperate gamble with a man she didn't know, a man who wore the uniform of the enemy. But then she'd remember the look in his eyes when he spoke of his daughter, and she would soar with renewed determination. Finally, just as the first hint of grey was beginning to lighten the cracks in the cellar door, she felt the last strand of rope give way. She worked her hands free, the blood returning in a rush of painful pins and needles. She kept them in front of her, feigning bondage, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Then, it happened. From outside, the steady chugging of the farmhouse generator sputtered, coughed, and died, plunging the world into a deeper, more profound silence. A moment later, a curse was shouted in German from upstairs, followed by the heavy tread of boots. This was it. Klaus turned to her, his face a pale mask in the lantern light. "Jetzt," he hissed. "Now." He moved to the steps, pulling his rifle from his shoulder. He didn't look like a weary old soldier anymore. His eyes were alert, his body coiled with a desperate energy. He gestured for her to follow. They moved up the stone steps, every footfall a potential betrayal. The cellar door was unlocked. Klaus pushed it open a crack, peering into the farmhouse kitchen. A young soldier was grumbling as he pulled on his greatcoat, heading for the back door to deal with the generator. The other man who had been at the table was gone. The room was empty. Klaus gave her a sharp nod, and they slipped out of the cellar, their soft-soled boots making almost no sound on the wooden floor. The blast of frigid air that hit them as Klaus opened the back door was a physical shock. The world outside was a sea of blue-grey twilight and falling snow. The storm had intensified, a blessing that would cover their tracks, but also threatened to freeze them solid. They didn't run. They moved with a purpose, melting into the line of trees at the edge of the clearing behind the farmhouse. For 100 yards, they moved in silence, the snow muffling their footsteps. Then, the shouting started. A sharp, angry cry from the farmhouse. Their escape had been discovered. The sound galvanized them. They began to run, plunging deeper into the forest. The snow was knee-deep in places, a physical barrier that sucked at their legs and stole their breath. Branches whipped at their faces, and the brutal cold burned in their lungs. Klaus was a surprisingly strong guide. He seemed to know the forest, finding paths that weren't there, navigating by the slope of the land and the shape of the ancient trees. Ellie, weakened by her captivity and the lack of food, struggled to keep up. Her legs felt like lead, her body screaming in protest. At one point, her foot caught on a hidden root, and she went down hard, her face plunging into the powdery snow. Panic seized her. She couldn't get up, she was done. But then Klaus was there, his strong hand grabbing her arm, hauling her to her feet. "Weiter," he grunted. "We must go on." Behind them, a new, terrifying sound cut through the howl of the wind, the baying of dogs. Brandt wasn't just sending men, he was sending hunters. The sound spurred them into a new, desperate pace. They scrambled down a steep, icy ravine, sliding more than running, and waded through a creek of black, freezing water that numbed their feet instantly. The shock of the cold was agonizing, but Klaus knew it would help mask their scent from the dogs. They clawed their way up the other side, their clothes freezing solid to their bodies. They were running on pure adrenaline now. The world narrowed to the next tree, the next breath, the next step. After what felt like an eternity, Klaus finally pulled them to a stop in a dense thicket of pine trees, their low-hanging, snow-laden branches forming a small, hidden cavern. They collapsed onto the ground, chests heaving, their breath pluming in thick white clouds in the frigid air. The barking of the dogs sounded closer now, carried on the wind. They were exposed, exhausted, and hunted. Klaus pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes wide with fear and determination, listening to the sounds of their pursuers drawing ever nearer. They had escaped the cellar, but they were still deep inside the wolf's jaw. Chapter 5. A debt in the snow. The barking was no longer a distant echo. It was a hungry, frantic sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. Huddled in the pine thicket, Ellie could feel the vibrations through the frozen ground. Klaus put a hand on her arm, a silent command to stay absolutely still. His face, illuminated by the cold grey light filtering through the branches, was a mask of grim resolve. The weariness was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He knew, and she knew, that this was the end of the line. They couldn't outrun the dogs, and they couldn't outrun the dawn. "They are here," he whispered, his breath a white plume in the air. He pulled the bolt back on his Mauser. The metallic snicked a deafening sound in the quiet grove. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes holding hers with a painful sincerity. "You cannot stay. When the shooting starts, you run. Don't look back." "Klaus, no," she pleaded, her voice a raw whisper. "We can fight them together." He gave a sad, faint smile. "One rifle against a squad? With dogs? We would both die here." He fumbled inside his coat, his fingers retrieving the small, tarnished locket. He pressed it into her hand, his calloused fingers closing hers around it. "My Lisa, my wife Anya, if you live, if you somehow can, let them know their father." He did not die a monster. It was an impossible request, a dying man's prayer whispered into a storm, but Ellie nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I will. I promise, Klaus. I will try." He nodded, a finality in the movement. "The river is 1/2 kilometer that way." He pointed north with the barrel of his rifle. "Follow it west. The American lines should be within 5 kilometers. Stay in the trees. Now go. Be ready." He crawled to the edge of the thicket. Ellie watched, her heart fracturing. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of her life. The barking grew to a fever pitch, and then a single sleek German shepherd burst through the trees, its teeth bared. Before it could sound the alarm, Klaus was moving. He didn't fire. He lunged, swinging the heavy rifle like a club, catching the dog with a sickening thud. At the same moment, a voice shouted, "Herr Druben! Over here! Lauf!" Klaus screamed at her. "Run!" He stood up, breaking cover, and fired a single shot into the trees in the opposite direction from where she was to go. The report of the Mauser cracked through the forest, a deafening announcement of his position. It was the ultimate act of sacrifice. He was drawing them all to him. Ellie didn't hesitate. Fueled by a surge of grief and adrenaline, she ran. She ran with a desperation she had never known, her lungs burning, her legs screaming. Behind her, the forest erupted in a cacophony of shouts and gunfire. The sharp crack of Klaus's Mauser, answered by the stuttering burp of an MP-40 submachine gun. She risked a single glance over her shoulder and saw him, a lonely grey figure against the white snow, firing from behind a large oak tree as 2, then 3 German soldiers advanced on his position. She forced herself to turn away, the image seared into her mind. She ran on, the sounds of the brief, brutal firefight fading behind her, until they were swallowed by the howl of the wind and the pounding of her own heart. A final, chilling silence descended, more definitive than any gunshot. She knew he was gone. The next hours were a blur of white agony. The cold was a living thing chewing at her exposed skin, turning her feet into numb, useless blocks of ice. She stumbled, fell, and rose again, driven by a promise and the weight of the small locket clutched in her fist. Her mind began to drift, flashes of her home in Ohio mixing with the haunting image of Klaus's face. The forest became an endless, repeating maze of snow and skeletal trees. She was on the verge of surrendering, of simply lying down in the snow and letting the cold take her, when she heard a voice. "Hey, did you hear that?" It was English. American. She tried to call out, but her throat was frozen, only a dry croak emerging. She stumbled out of the tree line into a small clearing and saw them, 2 GIs in winter gear, their M1 Garands held at the ready, their eyes wide with shock. "Holy hell, it's a woman!" one of them exclaimed. Ellie fell to her knees, the last of her strength gone. The world began to spin, the edges of her vision turning dark. One of the soldiers rushed to her side, wrapping his own thick coat around her shaking shoulders. "It's okay, ma'am. You're safe now. You're with the 101st. She looked up at his young, concerned face, a face that could have belonged to a boy from her own neighborhood. The relief was so absolute, so overwhelming, that it broke through her frozen exterior. Sobs racked her body, hot tears finally tracing paths down her frostbitten cheeks. Her hand opened, revealing the silver locket. The soldier looked at it, then back at her, his expression softening with a sad understanding. The war was full of stories that made no sense. She was safe, she had survived. But as they helped her to her feet and began the slow walk back toward the warmth and safety of the American lines, Ellie Vance knew that a part of her would forever remain in that frozen forest, alongside the memory of a weary German soldier named Klaus Richter, a man who in his final moments had disobeyed an order to save his own humanity. and hers.